Hello, everyone. My name is Michele Grzenda. I'm the president with MSMCP. And today is May 24th, and we're here to learn about ticks, preventing ticks, and a little bit about where white-tailed deer fit into this whole scenario as well. We do have about an hour and a half presentation total, and I'm going to introduce my co-speaker, Susan, in a moment. And then after that, I'll introduce myself since I'll be giving the deer talk after Susan. So let me introduce Susan. Susan Rask has a BS in biology from Tufts University and an MS in zoology from the University of Maine. She's an ecologist by training with an early focus on estuarine, ecology, and nutrient cycling. Boy, we should have you come back, Susan, talk about that sometime. This is like near and dear to a lot of our wetland friends. Susan has had a 40-year career in environmental and public health. She worked for 25 years at the Barnstable County Department of Health and Environment, managing a variety of environmental health programs. Most recently, she worked for 10 years as the Director of Public Health for the town of Concord, retiring in 2021. While in Concord, Susan collaborated with other local health and natural resource directors to form the Middlesex Tick Task Force to educate the public about the risks of tick-borne diseases. Today's presentation was a result of everything the Tick Task Force learned while working with experts across Massachusetts and New England. I'll just introduce myself right now, and then I won't have to stop when I take over the presentation. Most of you know I'm Michele Grzenda. I'm the Conservation Director for the town of Lincoln. Prior to coming to Lincoln, I was the Conservation Administrator in Weston and Framingham. Ironically, both towns adopted a deer management program when I was working as the administrator. My passion for wildlife started as a child when I was fascinated by all the feathered friends coming to my family bird feeder. Those early observations sparked an interest that prompted me to study wildlife management and environmental conservation at the University of New Hampshire. As many of you know, I enjoy diving into complex topics involving people and nature. Deer overpopulation and the impacts deer have had on people, ticks, and forests has become one of my lifelong learning opportunities. Ironically, in college, I interned at a deer research center where I collected fecal and urine samples from a captive bred deer herd twice a week for 4 months during the winter in New Hampshire. And this is part of actually a deer contraceptive study in the mid 90s. So it's kind of ironic that still in my career, I'm dealing with deer. So with that, I'll have Susan start. If people have questions, what I'd suggest doing is just adding it to the chat. And when Susan finishes up, ask Susan, I'll let Susan know what questions have come in, and then we'll switch off and I'll share my screen. So welcome, Susan.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here today. As Michele said, this talk is a result of the Middlesex Tick Task Force, which was formed by about 6 towns around Concord. The public health and natural resource directors of those towns kept getting requests from our citizens to give them more information about how to prevent tick-borne disease and more awareness. So we sort of pulled this Tick Task Force together about 10 years ago, and it was quite active for a number of years and has kind of been dormant, but this is the talk that kind of came out of it as the result of all of our efforts to talk to everybody we knew across the state, Department of Public Health, UMass, some other people that we'll talk about later on. So there's a lot of information, but and I'm going to go through it quickly. So write down your questions in the chat, and I'm glad it's being recorded because there's a ton of information. So I'm going to talk briefly about tick facts and life cycle, quickly about the tick-borne diseases in our area, and then I want to focus on practical prevention strategies so that people know how not to get these diseases, and then wrap up a little bit with tick ecology and some ideas about why tick-borne diseases have spread so rapidly in the last 30 years, and then Michele will follow up with the deer information. So to jump right in, I'm sure all of you have encountered ticks in your personal or professional life. What are they? They're ectoparasites. They feed on the blood of a large group of animals. Basically, they will feed on anything they can get their claws on. And that middle picture is their hypostome, which is the thing they insert in your skin, that barbed thing, which is what keeps them attached to you and makes them so hard to pull out. So, and the picture on the right, you can see a fully embedded deer tick, and it's pretty disgusting. We have a number of ticks in New England. I'll primarily be talking about the deer tick or black-legged tick today. I'm sure you've all seen dog ticks, which are more, they're sort of out in the hot, sunnier areas. They're much more heat tolerant than the deer ticks. The Lone Star tick is a southern tick that's moving up into New England and is of concern because a bite from this tick can make you allergic to red meat, and they're very aggressive feeders. And then they say we have the brown dog tick, but I'm not sure I've ever seen those, but I assume that they're here because they say they are. But mostly we'll be talking about deer ticks or black-legged ticks. And you can see there's sort of 3 life stages: the larva, the nymph, and the adult male and female. And the female is quite distinctive. It's the one with the red body and the red and black body. I'm sure you've all seen it. So how do ticks feed? They have this kind of questing behavior. They go to the end of a branch or a leaf, and they just sort of sit there with their little claws in the air, waiting for something to go by that they can brush against and latch onto. And I'm sure you all know ticks crawl up. They aren't dropping on you from the top of the trees. They're basically at ground level in the leaf litter or on shrubs, and they're going to attach to your leg or your sock as you go by, and then climb up. The important thing to think about is how big are these things? If you've seen adult deer ticks, you know they're about sesame seed sized, but more importantly, the nymphs are about poppy seed size. They're teeny tiny. And I emphasize that because these things are so tiny, you are not going to see them on you, and you're not going to know you've been bitten. I mean, if they get in your hairline, you're never going to find them. And even if they're somewhere like your armpit or even your leg, you're not going to see them. I remember spring a number of years ago, I'd been out cleaning up the yard. It happened to be a nice day in May. I was wearing shorts, probably the first day I was wearing shorts. And I saw this little teeny thing that on my leg that looked like a scab from being pricked by a rose. And I'm like, that's funny. I wasn't dragging anything prickery. And so I looked at it, and me being me, I picked at it. And it was an embedded nymphal tick. So they are just so teeny tiny, and that's a really important thing to know. There's just another picture of them. You know the adults are not very big, and the nymphs are much smaller. Ticks have 4 life stages: the egg, the larva, the nymph, and the adult. It's a 2-year life cycle, and each stage feeds only once. They feed as larvae so they can molt into nymphs. They feed as nymphs so they can molt into adults. And then the female deer tick feeds so she can lay her eggs. So you can kind of see the life cycle. The eggs hatch out. The larval ticks are born disease-free, but then they feed on an infected host like a mouse or a bird, and they acquire the disease. Then they go, so that happens in the spring. And then they kind of go through, and then through the summer and fall and winter, and then they become nymphs. And then the nymphal ticks hatch out in the spring. They're infected because the larva got infected. And then they can retain and transmit the disease back to the next thing that they feed on, which could be a mouse or a bird or some kind of mammal or a human. And that happens typically over the summer. And then at some point they molt into adults that go through the rest of the summer and the fall, and then lay their eggs the next spring. So it's a complex life cycle. I guess you could say it's interesting if they weren't such horrible little creatures. And this is a pretty good video that summarizes the life cycle. We can get it to play. This is from the University of Rhode Island Tick Encounter website.
We're still waiting for it to show its video.
I'm still waiting too.
Sometimes it just takes a minute. Oh, let's see.
We go.
Yep, you can see it now, Susan. Oh, we're having trouble hearing it, unfortunately.
Oh,
Let me see if I
you
can.
can't hear it?
No, I'm wondering. Let's see if I turn up the volume. Actually, there's a. Let me see. Yeah, is that already? That's all the way up. Yeah.
Yeah, I can hear it on my computer. Sorry, you guys can't hear it.
Well, I think even just playing the video itself will still be worthwhile.
Yeah, I think so too.
Yeah.
And then everybody can go to the Tick and Counter website.
Ugh.
So these are the larvae feeding on mice. So this is the larvae that feed and then drop off.
Is that it morphing? Yeah, that's it metamorphosing, I guess.
Yep. So the nymphs attach in mid-May. So the nymphs emerge in the spring. So the gist of it is the risk is highest in June and July from nymphs that have molted and become ready to feed. And the other part that you saw but didn't hear is that the larval ticks have fed on the mice and then they drop off, but they time that dropping off to daytime when the mice are in their nests, because the mice are active at night. So basically the larval ticks are dropping off in the mice nests. And we'll talk a little bit later about the importance of mice in the disease transmission cycle. So the important thing to get from this is that the risk of infection is year-round. Ticks are feeding anytime the temperature is above freezing. I've gotten them on me in the winter when it's like 41. But the greatest risk is in the summer. And the greatest risk of getting infected is not from the deer ticks, which are most active in fall and spring, most actively feeding, but the bite's much more likely to be detected. The greatest risk of getting the disease is from the nymph stage, which is feeding late May into August, and the bite is difficult to detect. So I never knew that. I always was really concerned about finding the adult ticks on me and not even knowing to look for the nymphs. And again, they're really hard to see, so it's hard to look for them, but I think it's really important for people to know this. It's key to preventing the disease. And this is some data from Massachusetts Department of Public Health. The top graph is the number of cases diagnosed, and you can see it starts going up in May, and then it's way up in June, July, and August. And it's believed that that's because of the bites of the nymphal ticks, although of course we're all outside more in the summer, but we really attribute that to the nymphal ticks. And then the bottom graph is also interesting because it's the age of people that are diagnosed with Lyme disease. And you can see the highest incidence is in kids age 5 to 9. And we think that's simply because kids are outside playing. They're out in their yards. They're out exploring the backyard. They're out playing in the brush and making forts in the woods and doing all the things that kids that age do. And then the incidence drops down sort of in middle-aged people, probably because we're all inside working for the most part. And then it goes up in older people again because we think older people just have more time to be outdoors. So let's talk quickly about some of the tick-borne diseases in Massachusetts. I'm sure you've all heard of Lyme, and then there are the sort of emerging diseases that have emerged in the last 10 years, babesiosis and human granulocytic anaplasmosis. Powassan virus has come on the scene, and that can be a very dangerous illness. There's also Borrelia miyamotoi illness, which is also caused by an organism similar to what causes Lyme disease. And then there's the Lone Star tick, as I said, which can bite you and cause an allergy to red meat. So this is ER visits for tick-borne disease. Interestingly, kids are mostly showing up with Lyme disease, and older adults show up with Lyme, anaplasmosis, and babesiosis. And we think that's because older people maybe don't have quite as effective immune systems as kids. The kids might be exposed to the anaplasmosis or the babesiosis, but don't become clinically symptomatic. But the older people are more prone to it, and you'll see that in a minute. You've probably all know a little bit about Lyme disease. It's a bacterial illness caused by a spirochete, Borrelia burgdorferi. COVID aside, pretend COVID didn't exist, Lyme would otherwise be the second most prevalent infectious disease in Massachusetts. It was discovered in 1975 in Lyme, Connecticut, but anecdotal information says it probably existed for much longer. It has become a growing problem in the last 30 years. In 2002, it was mostly confined to like coastal New England and a little bit in the upper Midwest. And by 2017, it's all over New England now and all over the upper Midwest. So it's really, and the number of cases is I think it's CDC, no, this is Carey Institute. You can see the number of cases has increased hugely. And it's also important to note that ticks can carry many diseases. They can have co-infections with Lyme, babesiosis, and anaplasmosis and other things. So if you get bitten, the risk is not just Lyme disease, it's other diseases too. This is just another CDC graph of how Lyme disease has gone up since 1988. So you can just see it's, and we think it's, CDC estimates it's really, there's the number of confirmed cases has gone up, but we think there are many, many more cases that are not completely diagnosed correctly for a variety of reasons. It presents with a number of symptoms: chills, headache, fever, fatigue, swollen lymph nodes, muscle pain, joint pain. So the important thing is if you have any of these symptoms that, you know, don't just write it off as the summer flu or some little, who knows what kind of illness. Make sure you seek medical attention. We also know that Lyme can cause chronic disease symptoms if it's not treated. There's also the bullseye rash, which occurs in about 70% of infected people. It begins at the site of the tick bite, starts as a red rash, which expands and then may have a clear center. And I almost think it's better if you get the bullseye rash, because then you know what's going on, you know you were bitten, but many people do not. So just because you don't get, you know, if you get bitten by a tick, just because you don't get the rash doesn't mean you didn't get Lyme disease. And it also can appear on other areas of the body, which I think is strange. A little bit about the Lyme picture in Massachusetts. It's widespread across the state and all of New England. Highest in eastern Massachusetts, especially on the Cape and Islands, if any of you go down there to vacation. And only 66% of confirmed cases reported a bullseye rash. So that's the DPH data. Babesiosis is a protozoan pathogen that invades your red blood cells. Again, you get these very non-specific flu-like symptoms like fatigue, fever, malaise, muscle aches and pains. And it can be a very life-threatening disease for those with weak immune systems and the elderly. Approximately 35% of cases require hospitalization. 62% of all patients are identified with babesiosis are over 60 years. So it really is often a disease of older people. Again, it's widespread across Massachusetts, especially the Cape and Islands, and the majority of cases are occurring in June, July, and August, which again speaks to the theory that most people are getting this from bites from nymphal ticks. And only 19% of cases report awareness of a recent tick bite. So again, that speaks to being bitten by nymphal ticks. Anaplasmosis is a rickettsial pathogen that invades white blood cells. Again, non-specific symptoms, can be a severe disease. And again, it's mostly seen in older people. And across Massachusetts, it's widespread. And again, the majority of cases are in May, June, and July, with only 40% of cases reporting awareness of a recent tick bite. So the take-home messages from all of this is, if you have any of these symptoms in the summer, even if you don't know you've been bitten by a tick, seek medical attention. I know the emergency room at Emerson Hospital, if you come in with these symptoms in the summer, at least, they will run a tick panel on you. If you go to another medical facility and they don't offer that, ask for it. If your doctor's office doesn't offer it, ask for it. And be aware that co-infections with multiple pathogens are possible. So you want them to test for the whole panel of Lyme, babesiosis, anaplasmosis. Get tested for everything. So before we talk about prevention, let's talk a little bit about deer tick habitat. Deer ticks absolutely require humidity. They die in situations that are low humidity. They just dehydrate, which is probably a good thing. So they're mostly living in the leaf litter and other shady, leafy areas like wooded, brushy areas, which are also providing food and cover for mice, chipmunks, deer, and other mammals. So your exposure to ticks is greatest in the woods, and in the fringe area between the woods and the border. Just the places we all like to be, which is kind of too bad. And also our neighborhoods and houses have encroached into deer, mouse, and tick habitat and altered that habitat. You know, we all plant these beautiful shrubs and gardens, which the deer just think are a salad bowl made just for them. And our bird feeders provide food for mice and chipmunks. So how do we prevent these diseases? I'm going to talk about insect repellents. I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on permethrin treated clothing. You all know to do daily tick checks. And then we're going to talk a little bit about landscaping and backyard interventions. So insect repellents can play an integral part in prevention. If you use DEET-based products, realize that DEET comes in two strengths. The 7% is effective for mosquitoes only. So if you want to repel ticks, you've got to look for the stuff that's more than 20% DEET. You know, you'll see it says like deep woods or backwoods. You know, it should list the percentage of permethrin on the label. So just check if you're looking to wear DEET to repel ticks. There are also botanical and organic repellents. They can be effective, but the effectiveness seems to vary based on the product and the concentration. So I know some people do not want to wear DEET on their skin, but just be aware that if you're going to use a botanical repellent, that it may not be as effective. But the important thing to recognize about repellents is that they are not sufficient to protect against tick bites. DEET does not kill ticks, it just repels them. So you know that ticks are probably going to attach onto you on your socks or your pant legs. And if you've got the DEET on your legs, it's just going to repel the ticks to go to areas where they could bite. I mean, you know the ticks are going to crawl up anyway, and now the repellent is telling them to crawl upwards even faster. So just be aware, you know, the DEET's not killing the ticks. So the best protection you can achieve is by wearing permethrin-treated clothing and DEET repellent on your skin. So if I could have you take one take-home message today, it's to wear tick repellent clothing. Clothing treated with permethrin really truly does provide long-lasting tick bite protection. It kills ticks on contact. You can put it on your clothing, especially all clothing, not just cotton. The permethrin really attaches to the clothing fibers. there'll be very limited exposure to you. You don't put it on your skin, you just put it on your clothing. And if you had to choose a piece of clothing to put it on, I would say your socks or your lower pant legs, because those are most likely where ticks are going to encounter you. Some people don't say, well, permethrin's an insecticide, I don't feel comfortable using it. I've got to point out that it's way more toxic to ticks than humans. It has really low mammalian toxicity. It's when you put it on clothing, it's really bound to the clothing. You're going to have very minimal exposure. And even if it gets on your skin, the absorption across your skin is really low. So it appears to be really, really safe, to use, and it really will protect you from tick bites. And now we're going to try another one that you won't be able to hear. This is also from Tick Encounter. And this just speaks to like the nymph crawling up your leg, and how if you wear permethrin treated clothing like socks, it will kill the ticks. And how hard it is to see the nymphal ticks. So now it's saying, can you see the tick?
Oh, that's a tough one. I see it now.
So there's the nymphal tick on the guy's boot. So there it is. There's the nymphal tick crawling up. So you can tuck your pant legs into your socks. That helps. So there's the tick repellent sock that's killing the tick. Yeah, okay. So where do you get tick repellent clothing? You can buy it from lots of places like LL Bean, REI, any outfitters have it. Go on Amazon, you can find it there. There's also a great company called Insect Shield that both sells the tick repellent clothing, and you can mail in your clothing for about $10 an item and they will treat it. So if you have a favorite pair of hiking pants or pants that you wear to work on trails, you can send stuff in for about $10 an item. They'll treat it. The protection lasts through 70 washings. So that's a really great option. You can also treat your own clothing if you want. You look for permethrin spray. There are a number of brands. You can get it on Amazon. You can probably get it at places like EMS and REI. Remember, you're putting it on the fabric only. You're not spraying it on your skin. And so basically, you're going to hang your clothes on a clothesline outdoors, and you're going to spray them. Until the fabric is thoroughly kind of moistened. Spray each side of the garment for about 30 seconds. You can also spray camping gear. You can spray your tent. I've been told that the permethrin spray does not interfere with the waterproofing on your tent, so it can be done. You can spray the outside of your sleeping bag, stuff like that. That's pretty, and I think it says it'll, if you do it yourself, it doesn't last through 70 washings. I think they say it lasts for about 10 washings. Some people absolutely do not want to use tick repellent clothing. Another idea is have a set of clothes you use for yard work or trail walking. As we said before, most ticks are very sensitive to dryness. So after working outside, take your clothes off and put them in a hot dryer for 15 minutes. The heat and the dryness will kill the ticks. And they say dry your clothes first, then wash them, because washing clothes does not always kill ticks. These things are so tough. I mean, I've picked them off of me and thrown them in the toilet, and they'll still be swimming around 2 or 3 hours later. Like, washing them won't kill them. You would think it would, but it doesn't. Of course, we always recommend daily tick checks anytime you've been out in tick habitat. Ticks need to be attached, we think, for about 24 hours feeding before they transmit disease. So you want to get them off quickly, you know, hopefully before they've started to embed or quickly after they have embedded in you. They seem to like warm spots like the back of your knee, waistbands, stuff like that, and up in your hairline where they're harder to find. And of course, once they're attached, they're not going to wash off in the shower. So let's talk a little bit now about prevention strategies that you can do in your yard. And I recognize that some of these are controversial, but I think it's important that you have the information. So the first thing to do is think about your backyard. I mean, mostly I give this talk to homeowners and just regular people, not to conservation agents, but I think all of this information is stuff you can discuss with your residents. And I like to get people to think about the areas of their yards that are safe versus more risky. So if you're out in the sunny, grassy areas, it's very unlikely that deer ticks are going to be there. As you start to move into the leaf litter and the bordering areas and the shrubby areas with the wood piles, people just need to recognize that they're moving into a more tick risky area. So that's an important thing for people to understand. So to reduce the risk in your yard, try to rake up your leaves at least around, you know, keep your border areas as leaf free as you can. Trim shrubs and low branches. So, you know, so where your sort of grassy yard blends into the border, try to keep that kind of clean. And, you know, mice love to live in wood piles and stone walls, places like that. So to the extent that you can make those mouse unfriendly, that's a good thing to do too. And then they say it's really good to create a border of wood chips or gravel to serve as a barrier between your lawn and the rest of your yard. One, it serves as a visual reminder, and two, the wood chips or the gravel are hot and dry, and the deer ticks are less likely to cross from the shady area onto your sunny lawn. So that's just kind of a picture of that. You do like a 3-foot wood chip barrier, especially around like rock walls and wood piles, and then keep things like vegetable gardens and kids' play sets sort of well within the safe zone where exposure is much less. Also, think about ways to make your backyard mouse unfriendly. You know, I hate to say this, but you need to think about your bird feeders, because if you get bird feeders that spill a lot of seed, you're just going to provide food for mice and chipmunks. You know, for a number of years, I fed the birds, and I love to feed the birds in the winter, but all of a sudden I had chipmunks everywhere and mice in my attic. So I stopped doing it, which makes me sad. Or look for bird feeder designs that have less spillage. This one has like a net underneath so that when the birds spill it, it gets caught and the seed doesn't scatter everywhere. Perimeter sprays are very controversial, but I want to talk about them anyway and talk about when they might or might not be appropriate. So the way I approach this is it's one tool in a toolbox, and people have to think about, or should think about, whether it's the right tool for them, which I think they need to think about how they use their yard. You know, do they have kids out in the yard, or is it just adults? You know, how are the residents interacting with their yard? So perimeter sprays are an insecticide application. It's only meant to be applied to the yard perimeter, you know, right where the sunny yard goes into the shady, leafy, leaf litter, you know, shrubby area. It's not meant to be sprayed all over your lawn. It's only supposed to be applied to a 3 or 4 foot wide perimeter. It is a limited amount of pesticide being applied, and it does target the area where people most frequently come into contact with deer ticks. The downside is it does kill beneficial insects in the areas that are sprayed. And, you know, I don't feel great about applying insecticides. But again, I think it comes down to how you use your yard. If you're an adult that's only out in the shrubby areas a couple of times a year doing your spring and fall cleanups, maybe the answer is wear permethrin treated clothing and leave your yard be. On the other hand, if you have kids that are out, you know, playing at the edge of the yard, then that's kind of a different consideration, and that might make you make a different decision. So I don't push this. I just want people to be aware of it, that it's an option. And if you're going to do it correctly. So it's mostly using permethrin, and permethrin derivatives are what are commonly used. They don't leach through the soil. They're pretty quickly degraded. And we recommend that you hire a professional applicator to do it, because they are more likely to do it than like Joe homeowner who decides they're going to fill their pump sprayer with permethrin and just go crazy. So it's probably better to get a professional. So I know I've gotten 4 or 5 flyers in the mail this spring, companies offering mosquito and tick control. People need to be aware that in most cases, treatment's not needed in your open lawn. So any applicator who says they're going to do your whole yard, no, not needed generally. It's really just a small perimeter spray. If you're going to do it, 2 applications usually work best. In mid-May, when the nymphal ticks are emerging, and again in mid-June. And then if you want to do a fall application after the adult ticks, when the adult ticks are getting ready to lay their eggs, you could do one in mid-October. I'm not advocating for this. I just want people to understand that it's out there and how to do it right. Also, really important to remember that permethrin's toxic to aquatic organisms, so it shouldn't be applied near wetlands or streams, and any application within 100 feet of a wetland requires approval from a conservation commission, which Michele told me I had to put in this presentation, and she's absolutely right. And then some of you may have heard of the tick tubes. These are tubes stuffed with cotton that's been impregnated with permethrin, with the idea that the mice will steal the treated nesting material and take it back to their nests, and then they nest among the treated cotton, and then that kills the ticks on the mice. And I'm sorry, the first video we saw didn't have the sound because it talks about the larval ticks dropping off in the mouse nest. Well, what if they were dropping off into this bed of treated cotton and being killed as larvae and never getting to molt into nymphs? Wouldn't that be a nice thing? There's not a lot of evidence about how effective these things are. I think you need to, it's pretty clear you have to use a lot of them, and so that this cotton gets spread all over the place. I can't guarantee they're effective. Again, they're another tool in the toolbox that people sometimes want to know about. I think they're pretty safe to use. I mean, it's just cotton that's impregnated with permethrin. The permethrin's not going anywhere. It's attached to the cotton balls. But again, you have to use a lot of tubes in a large yard. And they say to put them out in late July and August when the larvae are active, and then again in May. So this is something people can think about doing, but if they choose to do it, they should not in any way think that they've made their yard 100% safe, because there is no 100% safe. So the other thing I forgot to say and meant to say when we were talking about creating like the risky, tick safe areas, I know there's a big push afoot to, you know, the leave the leaves thing, like leave the back of your yard all in leaves. And I think that's fine. I just want people to have awareness that when they're going out into those areas, that they are going into more tick risky areas. So, but maybe if you're going to leave the leaves, the tick control tubes would be a good thing to put out there. Since that is an area, you know, the leaf litter promotes both the mice and the ticks. Ticks can be tested to see whether they're carrying a disease. So if you're bitten and you want to know that whether the tick was carrying Lyme disease or another pathogen, you can send it in. There are a number of labs. The least expensive one I know of is at UMass, the Laboratory of Medical Zoology. You basically go on their website, tickreport.com, you fill out your paperwork, you mail them the tick. They'll tell you what species of tick it is, what diseases it's carrying, and how engorged it is, and how long they think it fed for, which sort of plays into your risk of getting the disease. because we really believe that for most of these diseases, if the tick hasn't fed for more than 24 hours, it's unlikely they will have transmitted a pathogen to you. And even if they have fed for more than 24 hours, you know, not every tick is infected. So it's really, some people really want to get ticks tested. Other people just are like, I'm going to assume it could have transmitted a disease to me if I feel symptomatic. It's really up to the person. There are some great sources of information out there. The 2 videos were from the University of Rhode Island Tick Encounter website. This is a great website to send your residents to. It's designed for like the average citizen to read and learn. It's really user-friendly. It's graphically engaging. They've got all kinds of videos and all kinds of really engaging information. More locally, Barnstable County, where there was a lot of early awareness of Lyme disease in the 1980s, has a full-time entomologist named Larry Dapsis. Some of you may have heard him talk. He's a great guy and really willing to help anybody that wants to raise awareness about ticks. He's developed he's developed a really nice trail sign and these really nice rack cards that the Middlesex Tick Task Force puts out. And I think he is happy to share them with you, give you the PDFs so that you can get them printed yourself. The 1-bite rack card really summarizes pretty much everything I've talked about today. And in fact, a lot of my talk is really Larry Dapsis's talk. So I have to give him credit for that. He's so helpful and so generous with information. And he has done a number of videos. There's a picture of Larry right there on YouTube. So if you search for Barnstable County Tickology, these are great videos on a variety of topics. They're all about 10 minutes long, so I couldn't show you one and you wouldn't have heard the sound anyway, but they're all of those videos are well worth a visit. So I'm going to conclude with some ideas about why these diseases have emerged and spread so rapidly. And then I'm going to talk about primarily the role of mice and small rodents, and then Michele will talk about the deer. The Carey Institute of Ecosystem Studies also has a really interesting website. They're out in the Hudson River Valley, and for a while now, they've been studying how the environment shapes tick-borne disease risk, you know, with the goal of informing management decisions that can make things safer. So they're researching the ecology of tick-borne diseases and also how climate change is increasing the disease risk. So what they think is that rodents play an outsized role in amplifying the tick-borne disease risk. So small rodents like mice and chipmunk apparently are a huge reservoir of these diseases, which means they can be infected with the diseases and not be sick, but then every time or many times when a tick feeds on them, the tick just picks up the disease. And the mice and the chipmunks just go about their lives happily and just are a source of this disease. So when black-legged ticks feed on mice and chipmunks, they're much more likely to encounter the disease than they would be if they fed on another mammal. And they're much more likely to survive and become infected with pathogens. And, you know, it's not uncommon to see mice with 50 feeding ticks attached. I mean, how disgusting is that? And, you know, and they can apparently carry these huge tick burdens without having their fitness compromised at all. So that's really kind of sobering. Carey Institute also thinks that one of the disease amplifiers is the loss of biodiversity and fragmentation of forest habitat due to suburbanization. Forest fragments have a higher percentage of infected ticks compared to intact forests, and they believe it's because forest patches have lower animal diversity, fewer predators, and an abundance of mice. The loss of biodiversity happens when the landscape is home to a diversity of mammals. Tick-borne disease risk decreases. As I said before, the non-mouse mammals are less likely to be carrying the disease and therefore less likely to infect ticks with disease when they feed on them. Loss of biodiversity means we lose predators like fox and bobcats that keep mouse populations in check. And other animals are very efficient at killing ticks. We think opossums like kill 90% of the ticks that feed on them. So, you know, the loss of biodiversity really is having an effect on this, the emergence of these diseases. And it appears that climate change also is having an effect. Remember, deer ticks are active and seeking blood meals anytime the temperature is above freezing. And climate change is extending the feeding season and allowing ticks to expand their range northward into previously unsuitable regions. I'm guessing that deer ticks were not found in Maine 20 or 30 years ago. It simply was too cold. The winters were too cold. They're up there now. And climate change is bringing warmer spring temperatures and milder autumns. So that's means the ticks are emerging earlier and feeding longer. And interestingly, the number of US counties reporting deer ticks has more than doubled in the past 20 years. So that's not good news. So with that, I will conclude and answer questions, and then Michele can talk about the deer.
Thank you, Susan. This was excellent and so timely, thinking it's May. We're in the middle of sort of the height of the initial eruption of Lyme disease, and deer ticks are definitely out there. And so there were some questions that came in, so I'll just kind of run them through. Some of these are more medically related, Susan, and I know I'll let you give your disclaimer and feel comfortable as to how far you want to go into it. So Eileen asked about, will antibiotics successfully treat babesiosis and anaplasmosis?
I believe so, but I am not a medical professional. So I think that's a question for somebody else. I think so, although sometimes people can be so acutely ill with these diseases that, I mean, people do die from babesiosis and anaplasmosis, especially older people. They can be very, very acute diseases. But I'm not going to go any further than that because I'm really not qualified to speak to it.
Totally fine. And Amy sort of also responded to that, saying that her husband had both and took a cocktail of various antibiotics, and that took care of it. So I think it's a complex topic, right? Because it does seem like some people, if treated early, it can be I believe it can be a very treatable virus, and other times it's not that simple. So it is a complicated thing to talk to your medical professional about. Eileen mentioned that when she had the bullseye rash a few years ago, there was no suggestion of doing a tick panel, just straight to antibiotics. So you raise a good point, Susan. I think some doctors just assume, oh, you got the rash, you have Lyme, we'll treat you for Lyme. But maybe it's important for us to advocate for ourselves to still get a tick panel.
Yep, totally agree.
Someone wrote about that there's a lot of red tape regarding the medical field in Lyme. It all depends on the doctor you use and you see. So, and I think, I'm sure, Susan, you've heard this too, like, unfortunately, it's some people still struggle with getting doctors to get them tested for Lyme disease. It seems like such an easy panel to get tested for, and yet it varies. And so I think ultimately we need to be our best advocates when it comes to this.
I absolutely agree. If you feel sick, especially in the summertime, and you don't know what the cause of it is, advocate for yourself and ask for a tick panel.
Yeah.
Especially all of you that are outside working outdoors all day, every day. Your exposure is huge.
Yeah, I remember years ago, it hasn't happened in many years, but early on, I remember once my doctor knew I was in the outdoor field, like for my annual physical, she would just run a Lyme disease test just to see if I had the antibodies in me, which even if I felt fine, I was like, oh, that's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
But that doesn't seem to be as prominent these days. Jen Carlino from Easton also recommended, when we talk about spraying our clothes, that if you are doing it yourself, you might want to do it with gloves on, just for added protection with the spray. That's a good suggestion. She said if ticks need to be attached, another question, I guess. If ticks need to be attached for 24 hours, is it only on me, or can it be attached to some other animal for a while? and then on me for 24 hours total.
I think once they attach and start to feed, they're going to stay attached to whoever they've attached to. I mean, if they're on some other mammal, it's not like they're going to partially feed and then drop off and then go look for another mammal. They're going to fully feed once they're attached. So since most mammals probably aren't managing to get rid of them, I would just assume that if a tick is on you, it's it's going to stay on you till you remove it. And if it's on another mammal, it's going to stay there till it's fully fed, which takes 3 or 4 days.
Okay. And then Jen asked about, is there a time of year for raking? Others say leave the leaves over winter for other insects that need them. And I think you touched a little bit on that, Susan. And I think this is one of those areas that there's a little bit of conflict between sort of the conservation environmental pollinator category versus the, do everything you can to prevent you and your family from getting ticks. But
Well,
go ahead.
No, I mean, for many of us, at least for my yard and many of our yards, my yard fades from grass into brush and leaves, and I leave the leaves in the back of my yard because, I mean, it's wild back there. And I think that's true for many of us. We have so many houses that are kind of encroaching in the forest. I don't think it's realistic for many people to just be like, well, your yard has to be totally immaculate and totally grass and no leaves left. I mean, maybe some people in real suburban environments live that way. I think it's sort of a fact of life that in New England we have white-footed mice. Unless you're living in a really sterile suburban environment, we have them, and I just think it's more important to realize that when you go out into the leafy areas, you're in a riskier habitat, and be aware of the risk, and either wear permethrin treated clothing or do tick checks or put your clothes in the dryer or all of those things, and be aware that you've had exposure.
Mm-hmm. For sure. And then Jen asked about, so it is interesting, and it's good to clarify because I'll talk about this too, that the Lyme disease itself is being carried initially by some of the small mammals. The mice and chipmunks are known. Do you know, Susan, if it's also carried by moles and voles?
I don't.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that offhand.
Yeah.
You never hear about the ticks feeding on them, but that doesn't mean that they couldn't.
Right.
I don't know.
Yep.
But definitely the mice and the chipmunk are a huge reservoir of the disease.
Totally. And then just another suggestion, if you are struggling with, either Lyme disease or tick-borne illnesses, that infectious disease doctors are also a good recommendation. Like, obviously, advocate for yourself and know that there are specialists who look into this. And so just good for people to know that in case they want to go beyond their PCP is giving them a little bit of like, oh, it's just a bullseye rash, you got Lyme. Here's your doxy to take for whatever 30 days. That if you do need to advocate more for yourself, there's always infectious disease doctors.
Yeah. I mean, I think that if your primary care doctor gives you antibiotics, if you have babesiosis or anaplasmosis, it's probably going to knock it down unless you're sort of immune compromised. I mean, one thing about babesiosis and anaplasmosis is people tend to present as much more acutely ill. Like Lyme disease, you just kind of can be like, I don't feel good. I don't know what's wrong with me. A lot of people that present with anaplasmosis and babesiosis are really acutely ill and they end up in the hospital. So you're probably more sick than you can ignore, whereas you can kind of ignore the early symptoms of Lyme disease. Not that you should, but they're less acute.
Yeah, it's a very good point. Okay, with that, this mine will take about 30 minutes. I'm going to switch over, if that's okay with you.
Yep.
Going to share my screen. And Susan, you can let me know if you got to see the correct full. Okay. So my talk's going to be about, I have to move my Zoom controls because those are in the middle of my screen too, which is obnoxious. Okay. Deer overpopulation, how it affects tick populations and forest health. So I just gave it away. So, this should be like a typical picture of what a lot of us conservation administrators and just outdoor enthusiasts might see as we walk through a lovely open space conservation land in one of our towns. That I often will just look through the woods and see woods. But it was really when I started working in Weston that I started realizing how many deer there were truly in our open spaces. And I'd get this like little sixth sense, and I'd sort of look, and all of a sudden I would notice 6 or 7 deer staring back at me. Here's one picture showing just 3 deer that I happened to see. They're standing still. Like a lot of times I won't see them, and when they're standing still, we often see them when they're jumping around. So I'm going to talk about sort of the changes in the New England landscape, how that affects deer, deer biology and distribution now, how deer impact not only humans but also the environment, which of course is more my specialty, is the environmental impact on deer, and then talk a little bit about deer management and factors to consider if your town or city is looking into that. So I'm going to start with sort of a background of our New England landscape. If you have not been to the Harvard Forest in Petersham, they have a wonderful collection of dioramas that shows the New England, sort of like the central New England landscape from pre-colonial era through, I think, like mid 1900s. And so these pictures are and these sort of statements are taken from those dioramas. But as you can imagine, deer population has changed dramatically as our landscape land use history has changed over time. And by the 1500s, New England was home to over 100,000 indigenous people, with many residing in Massachusetts. In that pre-European settlement forest, natural ecological variation across sites, and ongoing natural and human disturbance processes led to differences in age, density, size, and tree species. You can see this picture on the upper right. You can notice the large trees and the large fallen tree trunks. And this is sort of the indicative picture of what things looked at pre-European settlement. But then, sorry here, a moment. For most of central New England region, European settlement occurred largely during the 1700s, following the tragic forced removal of the Nipmuc people. European settlers dramatically changed the land through forest clearing, hunting, and trapping. However, in Eastern Mass, the impacts of European settlement was in full force by even the mid 1600s, and the abundance of many wildlife species changed. Deer were hunted in large numbers for food, for clothing, and for market. Europeans greatly valued deerskin. They used the hides to make clothing and cover books, boxes, and trunks. This demand benefited the colonial economy, and the skins were actually used like currency. Merchants priced their goods by the number of bucks required to buy them. This is the origin of the term buck, simple for $1. I just found that today. I was like, oh my God, how did I not know that? Relentless hunting, of course, reduced the size and numbers of herds throughout the 1600s. The numbers of deer declined rapidly. In 1717, to increase deer populations, a law was passed which prohibited any killing of bucks, does, and fawns until August 1st. However, these restrictions happened too late, and by the mid 1700s, there were few deer near colonial settlements. In the 1800s, the numbers continued to decline. Deer prefer to live on the edge of forests so they can graze in clear areas, but vanish into the woods if danger arises. As settlers cut the forest for farmland, fewer and fewer forest edges remained. And by the end of the 1800s, there were fewer than 1 million deer left in North America. To save the species, the U.S. Biological Survey encouraged people to actually raise them in captivity. One of the early deer parks in the U.S. was at the Lyman Estates in Waltham. Also just found that out today. Deer remain in only the most remote places at that time. By the mid 1800s, conservation movement began in New England, and states tightened their game laws. In 1898, Massachusetts closed the entire state to deer hunting for 5 years. And by this time, natural predators of deer, those wolves, bobcats, mountain lions, were also extirpated. The population of deer however, began to rebound in response to favorable conditions. At the time, many farms were being abandoned as settlers moved west, and this resulted in farmland reverting back to meadow and early successional habitat, which deer love. By the early 1900s, Mass experienced a vigorously growing forest of hardwoods with edges and lots of regeneration. Deer numbers continued to climb again. And, interestingly, as we moved through the 1900s, growing up in southern Mass, I grew up in Plainville. My parents still live there. I never saw deer as a kid. I also played like deep into the swamp. And once my sister got a tick. It was a dog tick, fortunately, but it was like literally a harrowing experience. Like as a small child, I still remember like one of my vivid childhood memories. My sister having a tick in her hair, my dad having to pull it out, and there's I think lots of screaming and crying going on. But it was like the freakish thing. It was like, oh my god, this tick. So tick and deer were pretty uncommon in the 70s and even early 80s. But by the time I returned from college in the 90s, I remember starting to see deer more frequently as time moved on. Today, suburban development, of course, creates that perfect forest edge habitat that deer prefer. The deer population today totals 30 million. Nearly 95,000 of these deer live in Massachusetts. Of course, without predators to keep them in check and hunting access limited, deer numbers are continuing to rise, particularly in eastern Mass. I should say these pictures are all from Weston. When I would walk to work, I would often see just herds of deer, people's backyards, farmland. So why are deer so common in Metro West? We went through some of that. Right now, the state estimates that we have over 30, actually, I meant to say 50 deer per square mile is what I think the latest statement from the Fish and Wildlife deer biologist. Oh, I feel a coughing attack coming on. Okay, I'm getting under control. So there's kind of the bullets that I was able to add while I was hacking away here. But lack of predators, everyone's backyard's a produce department, like Susan mentioned. Birth rate is 2 fawns per deer. Doesn't take long for the deer numbers to increase. And in eastern Mass, it's really hard for hunters to find places to access land. There are laws in place that you have to be so many feet away from houses and roads. And a lot of conservation land and open space does not allow hunting. Some deer stats. Deer can live over 20 years. In general, their home range is about 2 square miles. Years ago, there was a study done, I want to say it was in Carlisle, where they tagged a few deers and with radio transmitter kind of determine where they go. And nowadays, the mortality factors, predators, that's like coyotes for young fawns. I do think coyotes take a fair number of fawns. Vehicles, we'll talk about disease and obviously hunting being a mortality factor. Again, back in the day, wolves, bobcats, mountain lions were a big factor for predators of deer. And certainly, indigenous people and European settlers took a fair number of deer. I'm going to talk a little bit about what happens when we have too many deer in suburban areas. I'll start with the public health risks, then go to public safety, forest impacts, which is sort of my specialty, and then property and farm damage. So this is the same picture you saw with Susan. 1 second, sorry guys. Hoping this cough drop like kicks in. And as Susan also mentioned, ticks do feed on a number of different hosts, usually smaller hosts when they're larvae and nymphs. But then oftentimes for the adult deer tick, their last blood meal tends to be a bigger mammal. So that could be a human, can be a dog, and certainly deer. And likely the reason they got the name deer ticks is probably because of the number of deer, a number of ticks they saw in deer at some point in the sort of natural history of, you know, identifying them. And I think in one of Susan's slides, she talked about how a female tick can lay 2,000 eggs. So it's a very complex life cycle, as we went through in detail. So what is that relationship about deer density and tick abundance? It is quite variable. It's not, the deer managing deer numbers is not the silver bullet, as Susan alluded to. There's a lot of tools in our toolbox, and I believe that deer management is one of those tools. So Lyme disease has resulted from habitat changes that have occurred over many years in Massachusetts and other states with a high prevalence of Lyme disease. These changes have been accompanied by the expansion in the density and distribution of white-tailed deer, the primary host for the adult deer tick responsible for the spread of Lyme disease. Deer do not carry the disease. However, deer play a critical role in supporting large populations of adult ticks and spreading them throughout the landscape. While there is scientific debate about how low the deer population must be driven to have a beneficial effect, several studies have indicated that if it can be reduced below 10 deer per square mile, tick population and Lyme disease rates decline. Now, again, if we're at 50 deer per square mile, that's a lot of deer reduction. In a 2014 study on the left, the researchers found that by reducing deer density by 87%, resulted in a significant reduction in tick abundance, nearly a 50% reduction in tick infection rate, and an 80% reduction in resident reported human cases of Lyme disease. Massachusetts has recognized the significance of tick-borne diseases to state residents, and in 2011, a special commission to conduct an investigation and study on the incidence and impacts of Lyme disease was formed. This commission released a report of their findings in 2013. This report explicitly links deer and Lyme disease. The report states that Lyme disease emerged as a result of three main factors: reforestation after the abandonment of pastures and farms, increased development, suburbanization, and recreational use of habitat. And the expansion in the density and distribution of white-tailed deer, the main reproductive host of adult deer ticks. Along with these factors, the increased density of human population in the modified environment puts more people at risk. The report recommends an integrated short-term and long-term prevention effort that includes deer management, along with education, personal protection, and sort of prevention around your homes. One second, guys. Luxor said it is. I just can't talk when I'm having a coughing attack. Okay. Sam Telford's a researcher who's done a bunch of deer studies related to ticks. He has a 2017 article, Deer Reduction, and he, the title, Deer Reduction is a Cornerstone of Integrated Deer Tick Management. He states that some confusion exists as to the goals of deer reduction as a mode of intervention. It will not reduce risk in the short term over large areas, but it is intended to reduce risk over time and in discrete sites. Deer reduction would be most effective as part of an integrated tick management program that comprises short and long-term approaches. This article from Entomology Today discusses Telford's findings, compares it with some other research opinions, people unconvinced of the deer management method approach would say that the evidence isn't clear that deer reduction was the cause of Lyme disease reduction for humans. For example, it could have been because of better education, changes in human behavior, or something else. Also, some of the places where deer reduction did appear to reduce tick populations were islands or peninsulas, which could have led to different outcomes if studies were done on the mainland. Telford states in this article that he isn't suggesting deer reduction is the best or only option for reducing incidence of Lyme disease in humans. Short-term methods like using repellents, permethrin-treated clothing to reduce the risk of disease must also be used. However, he does argue that deer reduction shouldn't be ruled out as an option simply because the evidence for reduction in Lyme disease is not as strong as that for reducing ticks by using repellents and preventions, etc. So, it's sort of the human health implications with deer ticks and deer is it's questionable, but I do think I think by reducing deer, you could be influencing the number of ticks. What I certainly feel a little stronger about is thinking about the public safety risks, and which is our next topic, and more importantly, the forest impact. So quickly about public safety risks, I think we all know that deer-car collisions is a huge issue in Eastern Mass. I'm sure actually throughout Massachusetts and the US. Stacy from my office found out how to extract deer-car collision data for each town. You can go to the Massachusetts Crash Portal website and using the data extraction tool. This is DOT, by the way. And once there, you can specify the years you're interested in having data for the specific town. Then you can click, quote, extract data. You'll be emailed a spreadsheet with the specific town's info. And all you have to do from there is filter the data down to collision with animals / deer. We looked at some of the surrounding towns to Lincoln. Weston actually has incredibly high crash rates, I should say. But Weston's kind of unique because the Mass Pike and 95 kind of border it. So you'd kind of expect quite a bit of deer-car collisions in that town. Our forests. So high deer densities can negatively impact forest regeneration and reduce forest and plant diversity. These effects on habitat can further impact other wildlife populations for which we're all responsible for protecting. So oftentimes deer will eat the early ephemeral plants, wildflowers that pop up first. So lady slippers and other early wildflowers are at risk. A number of ground nesting birds like ovenbirds will also be adversely impacted as the forest understory becomes browsed heavily. Unfortunately, deer don't like invasive plants, so often what's left behind is a lot of barberry or buckthorn. They also don't like ferns, so sometimes you'll get this big fern forest if you have too many deer. Here's an example. Several places are actually putting out deer exclosures. Well, this is not from around here. I think this is like Pennsylvania. But great example of deer not allowed on the left. Sorry, wrong way. Deer not allowed on the right. And so you see a lot of poison ivy coming in there. And on the left, where there is quite a bit of deer browse, there's just far less vegetation growing in the understory. In Weston, we even had like pine seedlings. Certainly all the maple and oak seedlings were being decimated by deer on our conservation lands. And then lastly, property farm damage. One of the reasons that we started looking at deer management in Weston was because people started complaining and issuing concerns about the amount of landscape damage and Lyme disease incidents that people were facing. This is a common sight in Weston. You get those quote unquote lollipop cedar trees where the deer are just browsing to their height of their head. This is a house in Weston where commonly you would see 2, 3, 4 deer in the front yard. It would be a rare day when I would drive around town and not see a deer in someone's front yard. And then farmers, both in Weston and now that I'm in Lincoln, have expressed grave concerns over the amount of deer damage. One night in in Weston, the deer ate all of the sunflowers right before harvest. And when we survey our farmers in Lincoln, they're expressing the same kind of concerns. Many of our farmers are required to put 8-foot fencing along their farm fields. Got like 5 more slides. I'm getting through this. So when we think about management, deer population, there's a lot of management factors. We want the herd to be healthy. We want our habitats to be able to sustain the numbers. And then we think about the human aspect, hunting, viewing, public safety, public health. Deer population goal in Massachusetts has actually been risen to 12 to 18 deer per square mile. Most of central western Mass is in pretty good shape. Eastern Mass is not, partly because there's just such limited hunting access in Eastern Mass. Sometimes we get asked about why nature can't take its course. I think with this group, we kind of understand that we have really screwed things up to this point. So nature is not taking its course. When you look at climate change, you look at invasive plants, the extirpation of our big predators, suburban development, we have created the perfect storm for deer. And I think this is my last slide. Thank goodness. I'm going to just leave this by talking about, if a town or municipality is thinking about deer management, which I am in favor of considering as an option. It's a tool in the toolkit, not only from the deer tick standpoint, but the forest health. Walking around Weston and Lincoln and seeing the tremendous amount of damage that's happening in our open spaces and what the farmers are dealing with, and the fact that we've really manipulated our landscapes to create this perfect storm leads me to believe that some type of management is an effective approach to try to reduce these impacts. We do have a deer biologist at Mass Wildlife, Martin Feehan. I'd highly recommend reaching out to him. It's also, as you can see, a complex issue. So reaching out to your boards of health, reach out to your land trusts, the farmers. Seeing who's interested in the topic, and also neighboring towns is important too. Public education. I'm going to end this quickly because I think you guys know a little bit of this, and I can certainly talk offline about that. So with that, I'm good for questions, but I can't actually talk. So let's see if anything came in. I'll stop sharing. Oh my goodness. Oops. I didn't stop sharing, I think. Did I stop sharing? Yeah, I did. So let's see if things came in here. Amy asked, would I be able to post this recording on my town's website? I'd actually probably recommend not doing that. I think it's good information. I guess I should talk to Susan. I think the information's super important to get out. I guess it's just a matter of, how much of this is more of like for professionals versus the public. So, Amy, why don't you reach out to us and we'll chat about that later. Oh, good. Someone asked what I talked about how many deer per square mile. Is that of land or per square mile of forested habitat? I think it is like forested habitat, but that's also sort of residential areas too. But like cities and things like that would be, or very urban areas, I think are excluded in those numbers. Okay, yep, I think I got all the rest of the questions done. Any other questions that people might have that for Susan or I that we haven't been able to mention yet? All right, I'm not seeing anything else come in, but feel free to raise your hand, real or virtual. If not, I'll mention just briefly that we'll send out this recording to everyone who registered And Susan, I tried to write down some of your key resources like Tick Encounter, Barnstable County, but I don't know if you're able to send me a few of those like resources, and I can also just send out a little quick listing for people to look at. That might be helpful.
Okay, yeah, sure.
I'll actually, and probably I will send this recording out to the whole MSMCP community, our conservation agents throughout Mass. I think it is a very relevant topic. And lastly, hopefully some of the MSMCP members will be joining us at our annual meeting, which is happening June 7th at Nature's Classroom. And so I'll be sending out another email blast about that shortly. And with that, I want to give a huge thanks to Susan, who volunteered her time to present us today. I think this was excellent. And I appreciate everyone putting up with my ridiculous cold today.
Well, I hope everybody found it helpful, and thanks for taking time out of your day to listen.
Awesome. All righty. Have a good day, everyone.